They said she was dangerous, yet the only thing she held was something they refused to understand. The wind moved slow through Dry Creek that morning, carrying dust across the wooden storefronts and settling into the seams of boots and silence alike. And right there in the middle of the street, beneath a sun that showed no mercy, stood a young Apache woman with her hands bound loosely in front of her, her posture straight, her chin level, her eyes not pleading, not angry, just still, as if she had already seen how this would end and chose not to fight it. And Sheriff Walter Briggs stood beside her, broad shoulders stiff beneath his star, holding up a small bundle torn from her grasp moments earlier, the cloth now hanging open in his hand like proof of something the town had already decided was true. And when he let it fall open, a few dried herbs, a small carved stone, and a strip of leather marked with symbols none of them cared to read slipped into the dust. And that was enough, more than enough, because a murmur spread through the crowd like heat through iron, low at first, then rising, twisting, turning into something sharper, something certain, and no one asked what the items meant. No one asked why she carried them. Because in this town meaning didn't matter as much as familiarity, and she was not familiar, not to them, not in her skin, not in her silence, not in the way she refused to explain herself even as the sheriff's voice cut through the air, steady, practiced, declaring that what lay at his feet was evidence enough, that she had crossed into their land, with intent they could not trust, and the people nodded, some slow, some eager, but all in agreement, because agreement was easier than doubt, and doubt took more courage than most men kept on their belts. And through it all, Ayanna Redbird did not move, not when the sheriff stepped closer, not when the dust touched the hem of her dress, not when a man near the front shook his head and muttered something about curses and trouble. She simply watched, her dark eyes moving from face to face as if searching for something that wasn't there, not mercy, not help, just recognition, and finding none, she let the silence stay where it was. Heavy, unbroken, and somewhere at the edge of the street, just beyond where the buildings cast their thin shadows, a rider sat still on a dark horse, watching the whole thing unfold without a word, his hat low, his hands resting easy, not reaching, not reacting, just waiting, as if he understood that sometimes the truth didn't come from speaking first, but from letting others speak long enough to reveal what they never meant to say. And the sheriff, unaware or perhaps unconcerned, tightened his grip on authority like it was the only thing keeping the town from slipping into something worse, lifting his chin as he spoke again, louder this time, as if volume could replace certainty. And still, the girl said nothing, because out here, words were cheap, but silence had a way of making men show who they really were. The sheriff nudged the scattered items with the toe of his boot, not roughly, not gently either, just enough to turn them over in the dust, as if the ground itself might confess what the girl refused to say. And the small carved stone caught a sliver of sunlight, flashing once before settling into stillness again, unnoticed by most but not by all, because the rider at the edge of town shifted slightly in his saddle, just enough to change the angle of his gaze, while in the center of it all Ayanna Redbird stood unchanged, her wrists bound but her posture unbroken, her breathing steady like someone who had walked long miles under harsher skies than this. And though the murmurs around her grew sharper, she did not answer them, not even when Sheriff Briggs spoke her name again, slower this time, as if testing how it sounded in a language that was not hers, as if saying it twice might turn her into something easier to judge. But she gave him nothing, no protest, no explanation, only that same quiet presence that seemed to press against the edges of the moment, making it heavier than it should have been. And a woman near the front of the crowd folded her arms tighter, whispering that silence like that meant guilt, while a man beside her nodded, because to them silence was an admission, not a refusal, not a boundary, not a different kind of truth. And the sheriff straightened, drawing in a breath that carried authority more than certainty, explaining again for the benefit of those who needed words to stand on that the items found on her were not common trade goods, that symbols carved into stone and leather rarely meant anything good when they came from beyond the ridge, that this town had seen enough signs before trouble followed, and he would not risk waiting for proof that might arrive too late. And the people listened because his voice gave shape to their unease, turned it into something solid, something they could stand behind without looking too closely at it. And still the girl said nothing, her eyes lowering only once, not in shame, but in something closer to memory, as if the things in the dirt had once mattered in a way none of them could see. And for a brief moment her fingers tightened against the rope, not struggling, just feeling its presence, measuring it like she measured everything else. And then she lifted her gaze again, not toward the sheriff, not toward the crowd, but past them, toward the far edge of the street where the rider now sat a little more forward in his saddle, his silhouette cutting through the heat haze like a line drawn with purpose. And though he had not moved enough for anyone else to notice, something in the air shifted all the same, subtle, quiet, like the moment before a storm decides whether it will pass or stay. And Sheriff Briggs, perhaps sensing that shift without understanding it, cleared his throat and stepped back, giving space not out of doubt but out of habit, preparing to move things forward, to turn uncertainty into action before it had time to unravel, while the town leaned in, waiting for something to happen, something final, something that would confirm they had been right all along. And in that waiting, in that shared breath held just a second too long, the silence around Ayanna did not weaken, it deepened, stretching across the space between her and the man who had yet to speak, as if the truth itself had chosen to stand still and see who would dare to reach for it first. The sheriff adjusted his stance as if the ground beneath him had shifted a fraction of an inch, though no one else seemed to notice, and he let his hand rest near his belt knot. Out of threat, but out of habit, the kind that came from years of being the man everyone looked to when things did not make sense. And yet right now, standing in front of a silent girl and a restless crowd, even he seemed to understand that something here refused to fit into the simple shape he was trying to give it. And still he pressed forward, because stopping would mean questioning, and questioning would mean doubt. And doubt was something a badge did not wear well in a place like this, so he spoke again, slower now, choosing each word like he was laying boards across uncertain ground, saying that the town had rules, that strangers who crossed into it carrying unknown signs and refusing to explain themselves left him no choice, that order had to be kept before fear turned into something worse. And the crowd responded to that, not loudly, not all at once, but in a low agreement that rolled through them like distant thunder, because they needed those words, needed to believe this was not about judgment but about safety. And yet even as they nodded, a few eyes drifted back to the girl, lingering a second longer than before, as if something in her stillness had begun to ask a question they were not ready to answer. And Ayanna Redbird remained exactly where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, her gaze steady, not challenging, not yielding, simply present in a way that made everything around her feel louder than it was. And when the sheriff gestured toward the items in the dirt again, calling them signs of intent, she finally moved, not to speak, not to protest, but to look down at them once more, her eyes softening just slightly, as if what lay there carried meaning far beyond what had been said about it. And then she lifted her gaze again, past the sheriff, past the crowd, returning once more to that distant figure at the edge of town. And this time the man did not remain entirely still, because Ethan Cole leaned forward just enough for the leather of his saddle to creak under the shift of his weight, a small sound, easily lost in the open air, but close enough for those nearest to turn their heads without fully understanding why. And he did not ride in yet, did not call out, did not interrupt. He simply watched with a focus that felt different from the others, not searching for confirmation but for truth. And the difference, though quiet, began to settle into the space like dust after a long ride. And Sheriff Briggs caught sight of that movement now, his eyes narrowing slightly as he followed the direction of the girl's gaze, noticing for the first time that someone had been there all along. And something in his posture stiffened, not fear, not quite, but awareness, the kind that comes when a situation stops being entirely under your control. And for a moment he hesitated, just a moment, before straightening again and raising his voice a fraction higher, as if to reclaim the ground slipping beneath him, declaring that silence would not protect her, that refusal to answer was itself an answer. And still the girl said nothing, because out here, truth did not rush to defend itself. It waited, patient as the horizon, for someone willing to see it without being told. And at the far edge of the street, Ethan Cole finally lifted his chin, his eyes settling fully on the scene before him, not as a stranger passing through, but as a man who had decided he was no longer just watching. The first step he took did not sound like much, just leather against stirrup and dust shifting under a boot. But in a town like Dry Creek, even the smallest movement could carry weight. And Ethan Cole moved with the kind of quiet certainty that made people notice without knowing why, his horse remaining behind as he walked forward alone, closing the distance one measured pace at a time, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate. And the crowd began to part before he even reached them, not out of respect exactly, more like instinct, like grass bending before a wind it cannot see yet. And Sheriff Briggs watched him approach with a tightening jaw, his posture straightening again as if reminding himself of who he was in this town. The badge catching the sun just enough to glint, a small flash of authority that felt less solid now than it had moments before, and Ethan stopped a few feet short of the scattered items in the dust, his eyes moving from the herbs to the carved stone to the strip of leather, not with suspicion, not with judgment, but with recognition, the kind that comes from having seen something before and choosing to remember it. And for a moment he said nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to settle across everyone present, before finally lifting his gaze toward the sheriff, his voice low, even, carrying no edge, only a question that did not ask loudly but refused to be ignored, asking what exactly had been found that justified all of this. And the sheriff answered quickly, almost too quickly, repeating what had already been said, that the items were unknown, that the girl refused to explain them. That caution demanded action, but Ethan did not nod, did not accept the words as they were given. Instead he crouched slowly, his hand hovering just above the dust before picking up the small stone with careful fingers, turning it slightly so the carved markings caught the light again. And a few in the crowd leaned forward without meaning to, drawn by the quiet shift in focus. And Ethan studied it for a second longer before speaking again, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to clarify, saying that unknown did not always mean dangerous, that symbols meant different things depending on who was reading them, and that sometimes what looked like a warning to one man was a message of help to another. And the sheriff's eyes narrowed at that, his stance holding but his certainty beginning to thin at the edges, because this was not how these things usually went, not with questions that did not accuse but also did not yield. And Ayanna Redbird watched it all without moving, her gaze fixed not on the sheriff now but on Ethan, not hopeful, not pleading, simply aware, as if she understood something the rest of them were only beginning to see. And Ethan set the stone back down gently where he had found it, not claiming it, not taking it away, just returning it to the place where its meaning had first been misunderstood. And when he stood again, the space between him and the sheriff felt different, not smaller, not larger, but sharper, like a line drawn in dust that no one had noticed until now. And for the first time since the morning began, the town did not feel certain of what it was about to witness, because the man who had stepped forward was not there to fight, and somehow that made everything more uncertain than if he had been. The town did not breathe the same way anymore, not after Ethan Cole chose to speak without raising his voice, because something about the way he handled that small carved stone had unsettled more than just the sheriff's certainty. It had unsettled the story everyone had already agreed upon, and stories, once shaken, do not fall apart loudly. They loosen quietly, like boards in an old porch shifting under weight that was always there but never noticed. And Sheriff Briggs felt it now, even if he did not show it, his shoulders still squared, his voice still carrying. But beneath it there was a strain, a carefulness that had not been there before, as if each word now had to hold more than just authority, it had to defend it. And he spoke again, this time with a tighter edge, saying that meaning did not matter if the risk remained, that he was responsible for the safety of every man, woman, and child in this town, and that waiting for certainty could cost more than acting on instinct. And a few heads nodded at that, slower now, less certain, but still willing, because fear was easier to follow than doubt. And yet Ethan did not argue, did not push back with louder words or sharper tone. Instead he stepped slightly to the side, changing his angle just enough so that the sunlight fell differently across the items in the dirt, and he gestured toward them with an open hand, not claiming them, not defending them, simply inviting a closer look. And he asked, almost quietly, whether Anyone there actually knew what they were looking at, not what they assumed, not what they had been told, but what they knew. And the question hung there, simple, unadorned, and for the first time that morning, no one answered, because knowing required more than standing together. It required standing alone for a moment, and that was something the crowd had not prepared for. And a man near the back shifted his weight, glancing at the others as if waiting for someone else to speak first, while the woman who had whispered before now kept her eyes on the ground, her certainty thinning into something quieter. And Sheriff Briggs let out a slow breath through his nose, his gaze moving briefly from Ethan to the girl and back again, calculating, measuring, searching for a way to regain ground that no longer felt as solid as it had. And Ayanna Redbird stood unchanged in the center of it all, her silence no longer mistaken for emptiness, but beginning to feel like something else entirely, something intentional, something that had allowed this moment to unfold without interference. And when her eyes met Ethan's again, there was no gratitude there, no plea, just a recognition that he had chosen to see instead of assume, and that alone had shifted the balance. And Ethan, for his part, did not look away, but he did not hold her gaze long either, because this was not about him, and it was not about her alone. It was about the space in between, the place where truth had been buried under noise and now had a chance, however small, to rise. And he lowered his hand slowly, letting the silence return, not as tension this time, but as invitation. And in that quiet, the town began to feel something unfamiliar, not fear, not anger, but the uneasy weight of realizing they might have been standing on the wrong side of something they had not taken the time to understand. It was the smallest movement that changed everything, so small most would have missed it if they were not already looking closer than before, because Ethan Cole did not raise his voice or step forward again. He simply bent slightly at the waist and picked up the strip of leather that had been dismissed as nothing more than a sign of trouble, holding it between his fingers with the same care a man might give to something fragile, something easily broken not by force but by misunderstanding. And he turned it just enough for the markings to catch the light, the symbols no longer shadows in the dust but lines with shape, intention. And he spoke not to the sheriff this time, but to the space itself, saying that these were not warnings, not threats, but directions. And the word hung there for a moment before settling. Directions, as in guidance, as in something meant to lead rather than harm. And a few in the crowd shifted again, closer now, drawn by something they could not yet name, while Sheriff Briggs watched with a tightening expression, not anger, not yet, but something closer to resistance, as if the ground beneath his authority was being rewritten in a language he did not speak. And Ethan continued, still calm, still even, explaining that the herbs were not poison, not tools of harm, but medicine, gathered from higher ground where the air ran thinner and the soil held a different kind of life. Places a man from this town might never think to look. And he glanced briefly toward the horizon as he said it, as if measuring distance not in miles but in understanding. And then his eyes returned to the leather, to the carved lines that now seemed to hold weight where before they had held suspicion. And he said that these markings told a path, not for raiding, not for hiding, but for finding something, someone. And he paused there, just long enough for the question to form in the minds of those listening before he gave it voice, asking who in this town might be in need of something found only beyond the ridge, something that could not wait for permission or approval. And the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was searching, turning inward, and somewhere near the edge of the crowd an older man shifted his hat in his hands, his eyes lowering as if a memory had surfaced uninvited, while the woman who had spoken earlier now pressed her lips together, her certainty gone, replaced by something quieter, something unsure. And Sheriff Briggs drew in a slow breath, his gaze moving again to Ayanna Redbird, seeing her now not as a threat, but as a question he had not fully asked. And she stood there still, unchanged in posture but different in presence, because the silence she carried no longer felt like defiance. It felt like restraint, like someone who had chosen not to interrupt a truth that needed to be discovered rather than declared. And Ethan lowered the leather strip back toward the dust, but did not release it yet, holding it between two fingers as if giving the moment one last chance to settle. And in that stillness, the town began to realize that what they had taken for danger might have been something else entirely, something they had been too quick, too certain, too comfortable to see. The question did not echo, but it lingered, settling into the corners of the street like dust that refused to rise again. And for a long moment no one answered, not because they did not hear it, but because answering meant stepping forward into something uncertain, something that could not be undone once spoken aloud. And the older man near the edge of the crowd finally shifted again, his boots scraping softly against the dry ground as he cleared his throat, not loud enough to command attention, but enough to draw a few glances. And he hesitated, his eyes moving from the sheriff to the girl to the leather strip still held between Ethan's fingers, as if measuring whether the truth he carried was worth the weight it might bring. And then he spoke, quietly at first, saying that his boy had taken sick 3 days ago, that the fever had not broken, that the doctor in the next town had nothing left to give. And the words came slowly, like something pulled up from deep water, each one heavier than the last. And as he spoke, the crowd shifted again, not away this time, but inward, listening, because now the question had a shape, a direction, and Sheriff Briggs turned toward the man, his expression tightening in a different way now, not defensive, but conflicted, as if the ground beneath him was no longer just uncertain, but moving. And Ethan did not interrupt, did not look surprised. He simply lowered his hand slightly, letting the leather strip hang between his fingers as if it had already said what it needed to say. And Ayanna Redbird closed her eyes for the briefest moment, not in relief, not in victory, but in something quieter, something like acknowledgement. And when she opened them again, her gaze moved to the older man, steady, calm, and for the first time that morning, there was something in her expression that could be read, not fear, not anger, but purpose, the kind that had been there all along, waiting for someone to notice. And the sheriff exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just enough to show that whatever certainty he had carried into this moment was no longer intact. And he looked down at the items in the dust again, seeing them now not as threats, but as pieces of something he had not taken the time to understand. And the crowd followed his gaze, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet unease that spread without words, because no one wanted to admit it out loud. But they all felt it, the shift, the realization that they had been standing too close to judgment and too far from truth. And Ethan finally released the leather strip, letting it fall gently back into the dust where it belonged, not as evidence, not as proof, but as something waiting to be understood. And he stepped back half a pace, not taking control of the moment, but giving it back to the town, to the sheriff, to the people who now had to decide what they would do with what they had just seen. And in that space, that quiet, fragile space where no one spoke, the story they had believed began to loosen completely, leaving behind only one question that no longer felt easy to ignore, not who she was, but whether they had ever truly tried to see her at all. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a door opening just enough to let light in where there had only been shadow. And Sheriff Briggs stood there with the weight of every eye no longer lifting him up, but pressing quietly against him. Not demanding action, not calling for force, but asking something far more difficult, asking him to reconsider. And that was not a question a man in his position answered easily, because authority was simple when the world was clear, but it became fragile when clarity slipped. And he looked again at Ayanna Redbird, really looked this time, not at her clothes, not at the rope around her wrists, but at her face, her stillness, the way she had stood through all of this without anger, without pleading, as if she had trusted something unseen to speak on her behalf. And for the first time he saw not a threat, not an outsider, but a person who had been waiting for the town to catch up to a truth she already carried. And he let out a slow breath, the kind that comes when a man realizes he has been holding on to something too tightly for too long, and his hand, which had rested near his belt out of habit, dropped to his side, not as a sign of surrender, but as a quiet acknowledgement that this moment required something different, something harder than control. And without raising his voice, without making a show of it, he stepped forward and bent slightly, reaching for the rope at her wrists, his movements careful now, measured in a way they had not been before. And the crowd watched, not cheering, not speaking, just witnessing, because there was no triumph here, no victory to claim, only a correction being made in real time. And as the rope loosened and fell away, Ayanna did not move immediately. She did not step back or forward. She simply remained where she was for a brief moment, her hands free now, but still, as if freedom itself was something to be handled with care, and then she lowered her gaze once more to the items in the dust, kneeling just slightly to gather them with deliberate hands, brushing the dirt away not out of urgency, but respect. And when she picked up the small carved stone, she held it for a second longer than the rest, her fingers tracing its edges as if confirming that its meaning had not been lost after all. And Ethan Cole stood a few feet away, saying nothing, doing nothing more, because whatever had needed to be done was already done, not by him, but by the space he had created. And Sheriff Briggs straightened again, his expression not defeated but changed, as if something inside him had shifted its place. And he did not apologize, not with words, but his eyes did not look away from her this time, and that alone carried more weight than anything he might have said. And the crowd, once so certain, now stood in a quiet that felt different from before, not tense, not expectant, but reflective, as if each person had been left alone with their own thoughts, their own part in what had nearly happened. And Ayanna rose to her feet, the items now gathered, her posture the same as it had always been, steady, composed. And she looked once more across the town, not accusing, not forgiving, simply seeing them as they were. And in that moment, no one stepped forward, no one spoke, because sometimes the loudest understanding comes in the absence of words, when all that remains is the quiet recognition of what should have been seen from the very beginning. No one followed her when she turned to leave, and that was the first sign that something real had settled over Dry Creek. Because in a place like this, people were used to reacting, to filling silence with movement or words or judgment, but now they stood still, watching as Ayanna Redbird stepped forward with quiet purpose, the small bundle of herbs and the carved stone held carefully in her hands, not hidden, not displayed, simply carried as they had always been meant to be. And her steps were unhurried, measured in the same calm rhythm she had held since the moment they brought her into the street, as if nothing that had happened had the power to change the path she was already on. And when she passed by the older man who had spoken, she slowed just enough to meet his eyes, and for a brief second something passed between them, not spoken, not explained, but understood, and she extended the bundle toward him without ceremony, without expectation, and he took it with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of what it meant, and she gave a small nod, nothing more, before continuing on her way. And that was the only exchange, no gratitude, no promises, just an action that carried its own meaning. And Ethan Cole remained where he was, watching her walk down the length of the street until the dust and light began to soften her outline. And he did not call after her, did not step to follow, because whatever had brought him into this moment was already complete, and some things were not meant to be held on to, only witnessed. And Sheriff Briggs stood near the center of it all, his badge catching less light now as the sun shifted overhead, and he looked down at the empty space where the rope had fallen, then out toward the road where the girl was disappearing, and something in his posture had changed in a way no one could quite name, not weaker, not stronger, just different, as if the weight he carried had been rearranged into something quieter, something he would have to live with long after the dust settled. And the crowd began to disperse slowly, not in conversation, not in relief, but in thought, each person turning away with a silence that belonged to them alone. Because what had happened here was not something that could be shared easily. It had to be carried, and the street returned to stillness one step at a time, until only the sound of wind moving between the buildings remained, soft and steady, like it had been before any of this began. And Ethan finally turned back toward his horse, resting a hand briefly against its neck before pulling himself into the saddle, his movements as quiet as when he arrived. And he took one last look down the road, where the figure had vanished into distance, then tipped his hat slightly, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself, before guiding the horse forward at an easy pace, leaving Dry Creek behind without a word. And as the town settled back into its rhythm, something invisible had shifted beneath it, something that would not be spoken of directly, but would remain in the way people paused a second longer before judging, in the way silence was no longer mistaken for guilt. Quite so. Quickly, and out there, beyond the last line of buildings, the horizon stretched wide and unchanged, holding its quiet truths the way it always had. waiting for those willing to see them without needing to be told.